Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, the conflict has been going on for nearly 3 years now. If we look at just this year, 2013, we'll find it's been a year full of negotiations, intense diplomacy, even a threat of military action. During this year, both the opposition and government forces made significant gains in the battle for control of Syria. However, it's also clear neither the opposition nor the government is strong enough to win. Also obvious, Syrian people are the ones who continue to suffer the brunt of the conflict. Families have been torn apart, entire communities ruined, and schools and hospitals destroyed. Let's have a look at the human cost of the war then. Since the start of the unrest in March 2011, more than 100,000 people are estimated to have been killed. The conflict has also created the world's worst refugee crisis in 20 years. More than 2 million Syrians have fled the country, seeking refuge in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey, Iraq and Egypt. The UN believes that number could top 3 million in the coming year. And the number of people displaced from their homes has risen to 6.5 million. Many are living without adequate food or access to electricity and medical supplies. There's been diplomatic movement, though. In November, the opposition Syrian National Coalition agreed to a framework for peace talks in Geneva. The coalition outlined several preconditions to its attendance, but it seems to have dropped the most contentious one, that President Bashar al-Assad steps down before talks begin. Some of the other conditions must be met either before or after the talks. The SNC's wish list includes the release of prisoners, especially women and children, an easing of blockades on rebel-held areas through humanitarian corridors, and the group also wants a promise al-Assad won't have any role in the transitional period or the country's long-term future. So where do things stand right now, and what's on the horizons of 2014? To help us answer that, we're joined by our guests in Manchester, al-Abdah, a member of the Syrian National Coalition. In Washington, D.C., Joshua Landis, director of the Center for Middle East Studies and a professor at the University of Oklahoma. In London, Haytham Sbahi, a Syrian political activist who's supportive of the Syrian government. And from Syria on the phone, Jawad al-Shami from the political office of the Islamic Front in Syria. Welcome to you all. Perhaps we can start with Mr. Haytham Sbahi. Will Geneva II succeed?
Will Geneva II succeed? Of course, it has to succeed, as the international community now agreed the resolution on the resolution in Syria, and only to solve this crisis by political means. And of course, we can see everyone now dropped the condition for Mr. Assad, and I believe Mr. Assad, President Assad, is going to be the man of 2014. He has to take tough decisions. He has to keep the countries together, and as everybody knows and everybody say, he is the one who will keep Syria together and will keep the Middle East, the whole region, stable and safe.
All right, let's get some perspective from one of the opposition groups and take the discussion to al-Abdah. Do you share that optimism there, that Geneva II, world powers, regional powers, everyone seems to have agreed on things moving forward? It will succeed?
Well, I think Mr. Sbahi either did not read the Geneva Agreement, which was signed on the 30th of June 2012, or maybe read it but didn't understand it. The main outcome of Geneva II conference is the establishment of a transitioning governing body with full executive authorities of all state institutions, including army and security forces, by the consent of both parties, which means each of the two parties have the veto over who will be in this transitioning governing body. And that means, logically, that Bashar al-Assad is no longer part of the transitional period. And if Geneva process works and succeeds, it will mean the end of Bashar al-Assad, that is for sure.
Okay, hang on there. That's an interesting point. I can see Mr. Sbahi is shaking his head, so I want to bring him in briefly. Do you agree with that reading? Any transitional government to come out of Geneva II means it's game over for Bashar al-Assad?
Yes, the explanation about transitional government is the government with different political views or different political parties. The position of the presidency is completely outside a transitional government. The government, the way it works in Syria according to the parliament and Syrian constitution, the government is one thing and the position of the president and the presidential post is one.
This is a proof that Sbahi did not read Geneva or maybe did not understand what Geneva is all about. We are not talking about transitional government. There is nothing called transitional government in the agreement. It's called transitional governing body, which will replace the current authority. That's the whole idea of Geneva. Otherwise, there's no point of it.
Okay, I think it's clear that your different perspectives on this. What I want to do now is bring a perspective in from an opposition group that's actually on the ground. If I could bring Jawad al-Shami into this. My question for you, sir, is how much optimism or belief do you have that Geneva 2 will work, will bring peace, whether it produces a transitional body or a transitional government with or without Bashar al-Assad?
In the name of Allah Almighty, let me say at the very beginning that any conference, whether Geneva 2 or any other conference, without popular support from the revolutionaries and from the people, then the conference will lead to nothing. Geneva 2, 3 months ago, when it comes to Geneva 2, the revolutionaries made a statement signed by 23 factions working on the Syrian land, saying that they refused to attend these Geneva 2 conference and they refused any results and any consequences of this Geneva 2. The reasons are numerous because...
Okay, let me jump in, Mr. al-Shami. My question is, even if you have a situation where, for example, a transitional government is put together, let's say hypothetically, that doesn't include at all Bashar al-Assad, would that be acceptable to the armed opposition groups on the ground inside Syria? Yes or no?
Yes, the problem of the military groups in Syria is not merely Bashar al-Assad. The problem is Bashar is a killer. Bashar has killed so many people in Syria. Bashar is a security regime, if I could say, and Bashar has arrested hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Our problem is with the regime and not with a person or a personality. We need not to go to this point. We are at different points with the regime as a whole.
All right, let's bring Joshua Landis into the discussion. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of common ground going into this Geneva 2 conference, does it?
No, there doesn't. And this year, 2013, has seen a big transformation in the way the world looks at the Syria problem. The stalemate between Assad's forces and the new emerging Islamic Front, which has been one of the big things that's come out of this year, is that the Islamic Front, there's been a sort of Darwinian process taking place amongst the rebel groups. At the beginning of the year, there were hundreds of rebel militias. Today, the Islamic Front has brought together some of the biggest militias, and it can speak, I suppose, for the rebels better than anybody else.
So
and
if they say,
they
Joshua,
do not want
Mr.
to
Landis,
see Assad.
if they say, you know what, Geneva doesn't mean anything to us, what's the point of this Geneva 2 conference then? Why are the world powers pushing for it? It sounds like the war's going to go on regardless, doesn't it?
Well, the war is going to go on, but the question is what America and the Europe can do, and the other international countries, is they can stop sending as much money as they used to send. This is also a war, an international and a regional war, a proxy war, and lots of money and arms are being sent into Syria. So if there is a little bit of agreement between those countries that there can't be a total military victory on one side or the other, and it's not clear that there is that agreement, I think that Russia and Iran are still thinking that Assad might be able to reconquer the country. Clearly, Saudi Arabia and others are saying no. They're still thinking that the Sunni rebels can defeat Assad totally. And so that's where the real negotiations are going to take place, is can you bring Iran, Saudi Arabia together on the table and get some kind of an agreement for a ceasefire and slowing down of arms, money, and so forth going into Syria.
Do you realistically believe that might happen, though, that all regional parties are going to agree to really cut off money and weapons going into Syria?
No, I don't believe that's going to happen now. But the conversation begins, and we'll see as the year goes forward whether either side can prevail on the battlefield. And that's ultimately what's going to decide it. Because right now, the Islamic Front has gotten together, and it believes, with a Saudi promise, that Saudi Arabia has said it's going to go it alone. It's not going to follow America and Russia, and it will pour in a lot more money. We have to see whether they really mean that. And if they are willing to pour in tons more money, give arms, load up the Islamic Front, the balance of power could change.
All right,
if
let's
they're not
take
really
the discussion.
willing to do that.
Let's take the discussion to al-Abdah. Do you see any scenario in which there could be some kind of joint government put together, including some elements of the opposition, perhaps some elements of your organization, the SNC, and some elements from the current regime without Bashar al-Assad?
Well, again, the main reference for our talk in Geneva and is the text of Geneva that was signed on the 30th of June 2012, which was again reaffirmed by the UN Security Council Resolution 2118, which makes it now a part of the international law. And it says very clearly in the agreement that we will try to establish a transitional governing body. It does not mention transitional government in any way or shape. It mentions transitional governing body with full executive authorities of all
say Mr. Landis,
that means that
governing body, can it include members of the SNC and some members of the current regime?
Okay, it can include any member, any Syrian member, whether it's from the regime or from the opposition or otherwise, providing that this member can both parties agree upon, and this member is not, does not have blood on his hand, and is not accused by any party, both parties, in any kind of war crimes. Which
very interesting point.
Bashar al-Assad and
very interesting point.
Which means Bashar al-Assad and the close circle around him will be excluded from this. Otherwise, nothing will work.
Okay, because that's one of the scenarios that is being put out there as a possible outcome of Geneva 2, is some kind of agreement between world powers to get elements of the opposition with elements, certain elements of the regime. Haytham Sbahi, do you think that that sort of scenario is realistic? Could you see it happening?
Well, the Syrian government from day one, they were prepared to sit on the table and discuss all the issue concerning all the Syrians. They never waved away with it, and that's their position from 2011. Let me say something here. I heard from Joshua, Saudi Arabia will go along. Is the international community, United States, Britain, France, all the countries will agree with Saudi Arabia or let Saudi Arabia to send money and arms to terrorist group, to al-Nusra Front, to Al-Qaeda, who is operating now in Syria, under the sweet name of the Islamic Front? This is not allowed. I heard, and everyone heard, that Geneva 2 will be also a conference to combat terrorism. Terrorism has spread on the Syrian soil, and the Syrian government and Syrian army has no choice but to fight. All the atrocities coming by those fundamentalists, from killing and maiming and cutting heads and doing whatever atrocities on the Syrian land, is Saudi Arabia allowed to keep backing these groups and to keep sending money and arms? I don't think. United States.
You've raised actually a really interesting. You've raised a really interesting point.
What about?
Yeah, Anas al-Abdah, give me a second, because while we're on this point, I want to bring Joshua Landis in. You see where the discussion is going from Mr. Sbahi's perspective, that Geneva becomes some sort of conference to bring together countries in a new battle against quote-unquote terror. Is that where the Western perspective is going, and is it converging with the perspective of Russia, Iran, and the Syrian regime, to perhaps create a new order, call it a government if you want, to fight a new battle where the battle line won't be drawn between whether you're pro or anti-Bashar al-Assad, but whether you're pro or anti quote-unquote terror or al-Qaeda?
Well, we have to see how U.S.-Saudi relations are going to develop over the year, because one of the big things is that we've seen ex-CIA Chief Hayden, Ryan Crocker, ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan, have both said that we have to begin, the United States needs to begin talking to Assad, because the al-Qaeda groups in Syria are worse. And that has not been expressed by any official in Washington who's still employed. But it raises the question, is that a trial balloon? There's a discussion going on within the U.S. administration. But so far, no Saudis, no Kuwaitis, the big fundraisers for the al-Qaeda groups and for the Islamic Front have not been put on any kind of a prescription list, the way Hamas or Hezbollah have been put on by the United States. So the United States has not made a decision about whether they are going to begin to prescribe any fundraising for these groups or not, and treat them as terrorist groups. But that's a big question.
That is a big question, but as you said, they're thinking about it already in Washington, D.C. Let's bring in some perspective again from the ground inside Syria, and I want to turn to Jawad al-Shami now and ask the question that if we do see this situation where there's an international and regional attempt to redraw the battle lines, and you have to make a choice as the Islamic Front, are you with al-Qaeda or are you against al-Qaeda? How do you see that battle? What side would you take?
The battle in Syria is not only within the hands of al-Qaeda or any faction that works on the ground. This is a sort of misunderstanding, as Sbahi is saying. I think cutting the heads of the children and is not a thing that started by us, that started by the Shia militias and the regime forces in Homs and in so many other Syrian areas. We didn't have Nusra at that time. We didn't have any military factions at that time, Islamic military groups cutting the heads of the people, and the massacres made and done and committed by the regime is the base of the violence in Syria. Al-Qaeda in Syria and other military groups in Syria are the main reason behind the international community failing us down and not working to stop these massacres. I am really astonished because you speak about al-Qaeda in Syria and you neglect all these Shia militias in huge numbers coming to us from Iraq, from Iran, and from Lebanon. I am really astonished because the bad deeds made by Hezbollah when he allowed his individuals to fight in Syria. I am quite astonished because the world is being silent for so long time. So Sbahi has to make clear some bad
if I could jump in, Mr.
made by
Shami,
other parties.
let me put the question this way. We've already seen clashes between some elements of the opposition, like the Free Syrian Army, and some other groups which are allegedly allied with al-Qaeda. What position would you take if there is an international effort to make that the new dividing line in the conflicts in Syria?
This crisis in Syria and this battle in Syria, we have already started to make lines, because the problems we as an Islamic Front and Islamic factions on the ground, we have invited everyone to go to the Sharia courts and to listen to these points, and so many problems have been solved internally. The Syrian revolution is the revolution of the people of Syria, and of course you will face so many problems following that chaos that is all over the place in Syria. The Syrians will solve their problems. The Syrians will be able to solve any problems without international intervention. The international intervention has to be there to stop the massacres against the civilians, and to help the refugees and to support those who are in bad need in such a very cold winter. We need not to give a blind eye to the crisis and to the catastrophes faced by the Syrian people. We have millions of displaced people in Syria and outside Syria. We need to concentrate not on few thousands who just belong to Al-Qaeda and
okay, understood.
be on top of the agendas.
Let me take the discussion, if I could, to Joshua Landis. You started out by talking about the possibility of a ceasefire, which you then said is probably not going to happen. No one's going to cut off their weapons supplies internationally. If that doesn't happen, if there isn't agreement for some transitional body out of Geneva, what's the alternative? Continued stalemate and fighting?
I think that's what we're going to see, is continued fighting. And in many ways, Syria has become partitioned de facto. There's a government-controlled Syria, an Assad-controlled Syria, that's on the west and the south. There is a big swathe of Syria around Aleppo, Idlib, and in the east, which is rebel-controlled. And the very northeast is controlled by a Kurdish autonomous government now that's established itself. And that seems to be the way Syria is moving.
All right. Briefly, Mr. Sbahi, do you agree with that? Is partition the alternative scenario if Geneva doesn't work?
No. That's why President Bashar Assad there, to keep a guarantee of Syria stay all together. Let me say something.
But can he do it? Can he turn around this war, which he hasn't been able to do so far?
Of course. He has all the institutions with him, and the security one and the military one. And he has his allies, which is more of the other side, which United States and this start understanding more the Syrian issues. Let me say something for your guest from Damascus. Perhaps he can tell us why he is holding 12 sisters from Malula, why he holding 2 patriarchs in the north, why they taking the women from Adra and they cut the heads. These people, they are going to be finished when the international community decide together. They're going to be finished as the Free Syrian Army finished now.
Okay, because we've got a few minutes. al-Abdah, it seems from the last 2 guests we just spoke to there, it's either partition or a complete victory for Bashar al-Assad. Either one fit your reading of the tea leaves?
Well, I mean, regardless of the objectives of the Russia, Iran, and surely the regime of changing the focus of this conflict from a conflict or a struggle between the people and the dictator to a struggle between Bashar al-Assad and terrorists, our main focus and aim will carry on firmly on bringing down the regime, bringing down Bashar al-Assad, because that would be the best meaningful positive result for the war in terrorism. The Syrian regime is the source of terrorism in Syria, and unless we tackle that, the war on terrorism will not end in any way or shape in a positive way. I think partition is not an option. Our people will carry on resisting. The Syrian people will prevail at the end of the day, and we will carry on. If Geneva does not bring any positive result, our fighters on the ground, with the help of all the fighters, including the Islamic Front and the Free Syrian Army, will bring a victory, hopefully, in 2014. Point, though, I'm pretty sure of that.
Do you have the same vision for a future Syria between the SNC and between the factions which have much more influence on the ground, like the Islamic Front? al-Abdah.
Well, let me say this very clearly. We have different political factions within the Syrian National Coalition, and also we have the Islamic Front, who we respect very much. And each of the political faction has a vision for Syria. The National Coalition has a very clear vision, and the Islamic Front has also a very clear vision. And I think the decider on this are the Syrian people. Right. And both us and the Islamic Front should agree.
Because we've only got half a minute left. Let me bring in for a final word in half a minute, Jawad al-Shami.
I say that partition is never be able to be applied. Syria has lived the years and years. Syria has maintained and kept its society. Partition will never be there. Partition will never happen. We as Islamic Front, we will continue our fight to topple the regime, and we will never stop until the regime is taken to the court with its close aides. Let me tell you that our fighters have a arrived and reached al-Abdah Square. We have 5 areas that are completely liberated. Al-Raqqa is completely liberated, and other cities in Syria.
I'm afraid, Mr. al-Shami, we'll have to leave the discussion there because we are running out of time. Let's thank our guests. In Manchester, al-Abdah. In Washington, D.C., Joshua Landis. In London, Haytham Sbahi. And on the phone from Syria, Jawad al-Shami. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this show, but also on our news shows. And, of course, online at aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. I'm Sami Zeidan. Goodbye for now.